My dear New Yorkers, you can imagine the excitement on board because we have not yet heard any results from the negotiations. Since 5 p.m., the committees are again sitting at the table, but the Cubans, they have a lot of time. An English ship, also with Jewish émigrés, couldn't land either. It's heading to Mexico, and may try to return here. An attorney from Breslau, traveling with his wife, daughter, and son, slashed his wrists and jumped overboard. A sailor leapt in after him and held him until a boat could haul him out. Even then, he fought back, still tearing at his wrist. One already has to have nerves like a horse to be able to get through everything. Paul Salmon came 4 or 5 times with the boats and sends you his greetings. Many boat passengers come to reassure us, but they bring no news. Goodwill and tension shorten the time. With 1,000 greetings and kisses, stay healthy, as will I. Till we meet again, your Julius. It's November 9th, 1938. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, has begun. Across Nazi Germany, Jewish homes and businesses are ransacked. Over 91 Jews are killed, 30,000 are arrested, and 267 synagogues are destroyed. It is a violent reminder of the growing threat that Jewish families face. But why? 2 days before, a 17-year-old Jewish boy named Herschel Greenspan shot and killed a German diplomat in Paris. In response, the Nazi regime unleashes Kristallnacht, 2 days of coordinated violence. I have just returned from a tour of Friedrichstrasse, and city districts where Jewish shops are being smashed and looted by youths in plain clothes, followed by large and smiling crowds including soldiers and others in party uniforms, wrote Ogilvy Forbes from Berlin. Police were taking no notice. This pogrom was the final warning for many Jewish families. Flee or face annihilation. In the wake of Kristallnacht, thousands of Jews began to seek any possible means of escape. For some, this meant booking passage on ships like the SS St. Louis. 937 Jewish people boarded the ship St. Louis on May 13, 1939. Each Jewish passenger held a Cuban landing certificate and transit visas issued by the Cuban Director General of Immigration. What these passengers didn't know was that Cuban President Federico Laredo Bru had issued a decree a week before the ship sailed, one that invalidated all recently issued landing certificates. The Director General of Cuban Immigration, Manuel Benitez Gonzalez, had been illegally selling Cuban landing certificates for his own profit. Now, entry to Cuba required written authorization from 2 ministries, and a $500 bond. But $500 was an impossible sum for most Jewish refugees. On May 8th, just days before the St. Louis set sail, 40,000 Cubans gathered in Havana for an anti-Semitic demonstration. They were urged to fight the Jews until the last one is driven out. On May 27, 1939, the passengers arrived in Havana. Only 28 passengers disembarked. The other 908 were refused entry. Although 743 passengers were awaiting U.S. visas, the Cuban government remained firm in their decision. The press began to give their sympathetic condolences. But few American papers called for U.S. intervention. On May 28th, Lawrence Berenson, an attorney representing the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, arrived to negotiate. Berenson was a skilled negotiator. He had experience navigating high-stakes political waters. But this was different. He wasn't arguing over contracts or trade deals. He was bargaining for lives. Cuba had recently enacted Decree 937, which retroactively nullified the landing permits most passengers carried. According to Cuban law, these refugees were now classified as illegal immigrants. In early June of 1939, President Bru made a demand: a bond of $500 per person, nearly $500,000 in total. Only if this money was paid would the refugees be allowed to disembark from the St. Louis. Legally, this wasn't a bribe. It was framed as a financial guarantee, a way to ensure that the refugees wouldn't become a burden on the Cuban state. But the real purpose? To satisfy growing resentment over immigration, and to protect Brew's own political position. The legal justification was shaky. Under international law at the time, no treaty or statute required Cuba to accept refugees, but neither did any law prohibit humanitarian asylum. Brew's bond demand exploited that legal gray area. Berenson was working frantically. He tried to negotiate the amount down to buy time, to secure funding from Jewish organizations abroad, but time was not on his side. On June 2nd, with no deal reached, President Brew issued his final order. The St. Louis was to leave Cuban waters. Immediately. Legally, the ship had no port. Emotionally, it had no anchor. Brew's administration had used legal mechanisms as a shield, not to protect human rights, but to avoid responsibility. After the ship was ordered to leave, the St. Louis turned towards Miami, Florida. Passengers on the St. Louis sent cables to President Roosevelt. He never replied. The U.S. State Department sent a telegram to the ship, saying they must await their turns on the waiting list before they may be admissible into the United States. As the St. Louis hovered just miles from American shores, desperate pleas were sent to the U.S. government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, fully informed of the refugees' plight, chose not to act. Officials pointed to the law. Under the Immigration Act of 1924, annual quotas were tightly capped and deeply biased. Only 27,370 immigrants from Germany and Austria could be admitted each year, and that quota was already full. A years-long waiting list stretched ahead. Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long claimed the government's hands were tied, but historians point out, with political will, emergency exceptions were possible. They simply weren't made. At the same time, the U.S. Virgin Islands had offered sanctuary, first in 1938 and again during the St. Louis crisis. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. suggested docking the ship there, bypassing mainland immigration laws, but the federal government shut it down. Secretary of State Cordell Hull dismissed it as legally incompatible, and Roosevelt, citing fears of Nazi spies, refused to intervene, despite no evidence of such threats among Jewish refugees. Public sympathy was rising. Newspapers reported on the ship stranded at sea, but even editorials that expressed sorrow stopped short of demanding action. Anti-immigrant sentiment, economic fear and the Great Depression, and growing anti-Semitism built a wall of silence. Historians continue to debate Roosevelt's choices. In Paper Walls and the Abandonment of the Jews, David S. Wyman argues that Roosevelt's refusal to admit the St. Louis passengers, despite having executive power to do so, was a tragic moral failure. Conversely, Robert N. Rosen defends Roosevelt in Saving the Jews, highlighting efforts the president made behind the scenes and the immense political opposition he faced. Ultimately, while legal pathways and territorial alternatives existed, compassion was eclipsed by bureaucracy, fear, and politics. So close to safety, the St. Louis was turned away. The ship headed back to Europe, and through the work of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, 288 passengers were accepted by Britain, 181 by the Netherlands, 214 by Belgium, and 244 by France. 533 passengers later experienced the Holocaust. Only a little more than half of them survived. After the St. Louis was turned away, Julius Hermans was sent to Camp Saint-Cyprien in France, a place he called a pest hole. Julius was later deported to Auschwitz. He did not survive. Those who have gone through this know, the only thing we can still lose is our health. Everything else is already lost. The voyage of the St. Louis stands as a powerful lesson in missed responsibility. Over 900 Jewish refugees were turned away, first by Cuba and then the United States, as a political hesitation and fear took precedence over human need. The U.S. cited immigration laws, while options like the Virgin Islands were dismissed. Rights were not upheld, and moral responsibility was deferred. In moments like these, history asks not just what was done, but what should have been done.